What's your percentage of my new champion designs ends up being an actual champion? So starting a number of years ago, they changed the way we make champions to not really support designers iterating on a champion design before it's approved. So what I mean by that is the way champions are made nowadays is very often production tells you what to make. Like, not the entire kit, but they're like, as an example, when I was making VIEGO, it was like, hey, we need you to make the Ruined King for this whole big thing that we're doing with the Shadow Isles. And he's going to be like a super cool thing that comes out at the start of the season. Let's make the Ruined King. For Zeri, it was like, hey, we want to make an 80 carry from Zaun. This season's going to be about Piltover Zaun because of things like Arcane, and so we'd like an 80 carry from Zaun. That also like feels like a bit like a Valorant character, which is why I gave her a aim and shoot. But nowadays, that's how it's been. And that's how it's been for a long time, where it's the majority of champions that are made are basically, they're made with the idea of production like has a goal of something like, here's something we think players will like in this space, and we should like try to make that. How things were years and years and years ago is there'd be a lot more like champion designers just trying stuff and seeing what types of compelling things we could make, and then potentially like attaching kits to those things. So like as an example, Jinx was originally made because there was this artist, Katie D'Souza, who drew Jinx and put up a picture of her on the wall. And then myself and a couple other designers saw it and were like, oh my god, that character is so cool. I want to make a kit for her. And so I made a kit for Jinx. Jinx wasn't planned to be released. In fact, she was iceboxed at the time. The plan was not to make her. The plan was like back then, here I can show you her concept art. This was some of Jinx's original concept art. So right here, this was original Jinx. And this Jinx was iceboxed. And the reason she was iceboxed is because she was too similar to Miss Fortune. So there was a lot of like, yeah, that character looks cool, but you know, we already have a character with that body type. We already have a character that runs around with these twin pistols, right? She was, that's Miss Fortune. Like, we don't need another Miss Fortune. And so Jinx was iceboxed. But the artist had, like, there's a lot of really, really cool things about this character. And so a number of other people at Riot, including myself, saw this and was like, oh my god, I love her. She's so great. And so worked with Katie to define her personality a bit more and, like, you know, what she would act like, and made a kit for a ranged Udyr. So I, as a designer, I'd always wanted to make a ranged Udyr, some like kind of like Udyr character who swapped weapons, right? And this character had a bunch of guns, so it made a lot of sense. Funnily enough, Jinx came about because a character I was working on got canceled. After shipping Vi, the next character I was assigned to was something called Yordle on a Griffin. And it was a Yordle on a Griffin. That, as simple as that. It was a little Yordle knight, and he flew around on a Griffin, and they were best friends, and they did nightly quests and stuff. And my kit for that character was terrible. It was really bad. And I was too junior to realize it. I was too junior to really truly understand all the problems with my Yordle on a Griffin kit. And so eventually, the design lead on the team at the time made the call to cancel the character. Because it was like, hey, this character is not working. And at that time, we only had a certain number of characters we could make. And so it was chosen that old Aatrox and an older version of Azir that also got canceled would be made instead of Yordle on the Griffin. Because Yordle on the Griffin was by far the worst of those three kits. Learned a lot since then. And so then, but the cool thing was I'd been working on Jinx in the background. So I had this whole kit for Jinx written up, and I've been talking to Katie and a writer, Rob, about all these different things this character could be. And so when Yordle and the Griffin got canceled, I had a Jinx kit ready to go. And I was like, okay, well, if that character isn't working out, what about this one? And started testing that kit, and that kit tested very, very well, actually. And we were eventually able to get Jinx approved and then made her. And so it's kind of like a different process where, like, again, nowadays what typically happens is production has kind of like plans for what we're going to be doing over the next year or two or even three. And then designers are often like assigned to some of those like characters. They're like, hey, we need to make this type of character, we need to make this type of kit, we need to make a top laner, stuff like that. Whereas back when I started at Riot, there was a lot more like a designer will go fiddle around in the tools and potentially find something cool, or an artist will have a cool piece of art that they posted on a wall, which will get picked up. But nowadays, things are planned a lot more in advance, and they're kind of like assigned to you, is typically what happens. So yeah, that's Jinx. That's how Jinx came about. Long question answer, I suppose. Can you show us all canceled characters? There hasn't been many canceled characters for a very long time. Ever since we switched to this new thing where the production kind of assigns things, most characters don't get canceled. Canceled characters, one of them was actually AURORA. And AURORA wasn't canceled, she was turned into Sylas. So that's a character that was pretty cool and pretty fleshed out and basically like didn't make it and instead like got reworked into Sylas. But the artist and the designer really liked the character, AURORA, and then eventually she came back and now we're about to ship her, right? So sometimes canceled characters come back. Lucian at various points got like iceboxed and remade. AZIR'S at various points got iceboxed and remade. AZIR'S used to have an entirely different kit. AZIR'S original kit, not original kit, but one of the kits he had that almost shipped, by the way. The only reason this kit didn't ship is because he was supposed to ship for the something we were calling the Shurima event, and the Shurima event got canceled. And so AZIR'S was like waiting until the Shurima event happened, and then during that time we were like, actually this kit isn't all that amazing, we probably should rework it. And so AZIR'S got reworked, but his original kit was this very long range poke character. And so what he had is his Q basically charged up these soldiers that would, like, the longer you held it, the more soldiers that would come out in a line, and then they would charge forward and stab people. And it was very, very long range and did a ton of damage. And so his main pattern actually was, to some degree, he would be standing off of your screen, charging this wave of soldiers that would then run forward and hit you. And so that was like one of his major spells. He had another spell he had was Sand Geyser, which would basically, it would shoot out a geyser of sand, and if the geyser hit you, it would knock you up. So like a good combo he had, he'd charge the soldiers, he'd hit you with the sand geyser, knocking you up, and then he'd let the soldiers go and they'd charge forward and stab you. His W was just quick sand. He'd put a pool of sand on the ground that slowed people, and it slowed people more towards the center. That was it. It just created sand, and then if you were on the sand, you were slow. His ultimate was called the Death Windmill. And what it was is he raised this obelisk from Shurima. He basically would raise a Shuriman obelisk, and the obelisk had these damage beams that like looked like the spokes of a windmill, and they would spin in a circle. And if you got hit by the damage beams, you would take a lot of damage. And so like AZIR'S basically put this down into team fight and make this like rotating no-go zone for the enemy that would cause them to like die if they got hit by the damage beams. And then the passive was a resurrection passive. Basically, if AZIR'S died, when he would revive as a sandstorm, and then he would go really, really fast out to the map. So basically, he got like well-themed home guard boots whenever he died, basically. So you'd revive as a sandstorm, and you'd zoom out to where you wanted to go on the map, and then you'd respawn there. So yeah, that was old AZIR'S. But that kit got eventually reworked into the one we have now, because it was kind of just determined like, oh, maybe this isn't the best version of the champ. Do I prefer the old or new way of champion creation? I think both ways have merit. My personal preference would be for something that combines both. And so what I mean by that is, sometimes the best champion you could be making is a champion that's really defined for a product reason. So as an example, I was told to make VIEGO, the Ruined King, because we were doing this whole thing about the Shadow Isles. And I think that was a really great decision. I'm really glad I got to work on VIEGO, and I thought that's like really good targeting for a character. It's like, hey, we should make the Ruined King. Like, how cool would that be, right? Like, so sometimes a character being like more like, we have an event that we're doing, or like this really cool thing that this character would fit into perfectly, I think makes a lot of sense and is like the ideal way to make champions. On the other hand, I think sometimes some of the coolest champions, some of the coolest potential for a champion is what happens when you let an artist or a designer just kind of like fiddle around with things and be like really creative and make something that they believe in. And so to me, the ideal process for making champions would be a mix of both, where some characters we plan on making are about like an event or a story or a specific goal with like, we need this certain type of character, stuff like that. Whereas having a few slots each year that are more about like, hey, some artists or writers or champion designers got together and made something crazy, I think is also like really, can get really good stuff as well. So like a mix of both, basically. What was the kit like for Griffin Yordle? Griffin Yordle, I think the big mistake I made with Griffin Yordle is that I wanted it to be a tank, which is a huge mistake. When I'm about to tell you what the kit is, and you're gonna be like, yeah, that probably was a mistake to make it a tank. So Yordle and a Griffin, the only good thing about the kit was the passive. The passive for Yordle and a Griffin was, it was a kind of like some really good mobility boots. It was, if you hadn't fought for a while, you'd start running and then you would take flight because you were on a Griffin, right? So you'd start flying. And while you were flying, you'd move a lot faster, like you had mobility boots. And then your next attack would be a dive bomb attack where you like dive forward and lance into the enemy. He had a lance. That was his weapon, was a lance. And so it was this pretty cool spell where you'd run and you'd build up momentum and then you'd dive bomb forward and stab a guy. Really cool. Loved that spell. Thought it worked really well for the character. That was his passive. His Q was he would stab the lance and it would like do a lance forward in a rectangle and stun everything. So this guy was a tank, and so he was a tank that could basically run at you with Moby Boots and immediately stun you on impact because his Q was like a next attack thing that said lance forward and stun guys. So that was messed up. Not very fair. His E was actually Zeri E. He could fly over walls, and so it was a dash that if it hit a wall, it would take him to the other end of the wall. So, yeah, I've had Zeri E in my pocket for a very long time. Had that on the second character I worked on. And so that was Zeri E. I don't remember what his W was. And his ultimate was he would click on someone and fly up into the air and then freaking crash down on them and do like an AoE knockup. Anyways, the thing I think I screwed up with there, aside from just like feel and whatnot, is that I think I should have focused on making the guy more of a skirmisher. Back then we didn't have the terms for skirmisher, but like if Yordle and a Griffin had been based around that passive running around and been more of like a light fighter or a skirmisher where you're kind of squishy but you're really mobile and like you kind of like get in and out of a fight flying around and stabbing people, I think that would have been a pretty great kit and a pretty fun champion. But the character I was trying to make was a frontline tank who was very mobile and very problematic. And yeah, it just didn't work out, I don't think. And the thing I ran into, the reason this character got canceled, looking back, like one of the reasons, and here's some like advice for you as your designer, is that I wasn't able to take feedback. And so when people gave me feedback that the character wasn't working, this was like 22-year-old August, just started designing champions, just started working in general. Like, you know, I'd worked in college a lot, but you know, and it was whenever people gave me negative feedback about the character, a lot of times the way I would interpret it was they just don't see the vision, as opposed to being like, oh, there might be something wrong. Maybe there's something I should fix here. Maybe there's something that needs to be improved. And so I interpreted a lot of the feedback I got on the character as like, these folks just don't get it, or these folks are just frustrated, but that's fine, or things like that. And that was just the wrong way to interpret feedback and think about things. I needed to be, I think that character would have been, potentially could have been a lot more, could have been successful and maybe not gotten canceled if I'd been better able to like see my peers and be like, oh yeah, here are all the reasons they're frustrated right now. Here are all the reasons they aren't having fun on the character. Here's all the reasons that, that there's potential problems and things that are happening. And so I think I just had a very hard time back then, like parsing negative feedback in a way that would cause positive changes to a character. And that's something that's very, very important as a designer, is you're going to get a lot of negative feedback about the stuff you work on, and being able to accept that feedback and understand it and like be able to like draw out the changes that need to be made after someone gives you feedback of like, hey, this wasn't fun, or hey, this wasn't fun to play against, or hey, this had problems, is like really, really important as a designer. And that was something I was, actively learning when I started. And I think it ended up causing that character to suffer. They'll never understand my vision, for they are low elo. Well, that's the other funny thing, is that like a lot of people think like a lot of like designers and whatnot at Riot are low elo. It's like actually the opposite. Like a lot of designers are like really, really high elo. Like a lot of the people that were telling me this character I was working on was a problem were like top rated players.